Working Cows Podcast, Episode 5.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
This episode has been brought to you in part by Kamak Ranch Supply. Check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. This episode is also brought to you by chriswilliamsaudio.com. If you're a musician, podcaster, or filmmaker, don't settle for audio that's less than professional. Head on over to chriswilliamsaudio.com for all your podcasting, music production, and film audio needs. Our guest today on the Working Cows podcast is Paul Jungnitsch. Paul is a greenhouse gas agrologist with Alberta Ag and Forestry. Paul launched a study for his master's thesis on the effects of cattle winter feeding systems on forage production, soil nutrients, animal performance, and economics. We're inviting Paul on as our guest today to discuss that. It is my pleasure to have Paul on. I hope you enjoy this episode with Paul Jungnitsch of Alberta Ag and Forestry. Paul Jungnitsch, thanks for joining me today here on the Working Cows podcast. I'm looking forward to a conversation again. I appreciate you being willing to come back on again after a mistake on my end. So thank you so much for bearing with me. And we're going to talk today about a paper that you wrote for a master's thesis called The Effect of Cattle Winter Feeding Systems on Soil Nutrients, Forage Growth, and Animal Performance and Economics. So if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself a little bit and kind of tell us about what brought you to start this study and some of the things that led up to where you are today and what you're doing.
Okay, I did research for a farmer group up in northern Alberta in Canada. It was mostly crop production, but I worked next to the guy who was in charge of the forage and cattle side. And he was looking into something called, they were bale grazing and feeding their cattle out in the pasture in the wintertime and seeing a very good forage growth and good, looked like nutrient return. And when I went back to university, I did an undergrad and did a master's, and the project I got, they were kind of looking at sort of the same thing. They were thinking of feeding cows out on a stubble field. And because I knew of this work that had been done up north in the Peace where I was from, I convinced them to test the same concept of feeding cows out on pasture versus feeding them in a corral. And we could, because it was a university project, we can put a lot more effort, into it. We could do a lot more measurement, and that's how that went.
Sure. And the stubble field was a crop field. Is that correct?
Yeah, I can say that was their intention, but we ended up convinced them to feed on a pasture, on a grass. Again, I kind of knew from seeing it what guys were doing up north that. When you feed cows, you're going to get a lot of nutrient return. And that's kind of a good thing and kind of not a good thing on a stubble field, right? Whereas on a pasture, uneven nutrients isn't a big problem. Plus, if you get manure piled up and you get straw piled up, again, not a big problem on a pasture, but a bit more when you're doing crop production.
Sure. And so you guys did this on a pasture plot, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit about the study itself, how it was kind of laid out, and some of the different control things you had to determine the differences you guys were able to achieve through your strategy?
Yeah, well, the idea was to compare feeding cows in a corral or a pen, I guess, the normal way, and spreading the manure on a pasture versus feeding them directly out on the pasture itself. So either basically comparing spreading the manure by machine versus spreading the manure by a cow. So we had it's a pasture Russian wild rye, and we did treatments for the manure, spreading manure at, I believe it was 30 tons an acre, roughly, and then spreading compost at 10 tons an acre. And then we left the check. And beside that, on the same pasture, we fenced an area, I think it was 5 acres. We fed cows over the winter with a bale grazing technique. And then beside it, we fenced another 5 acres and we fed them with a bale processor.
Sure.
And we worked out, the idea was that the cow days per acre, the cows would spread the same amount of manure that I was spreading with the tractor at the 30 tons.
Sure. Gotcha. And so you said that there was a check, and that was a place on the field where you did no fertilization of any kind, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. And so were there any surprises that came about because of this study?
Yeah, like I kind of expected, that you were going to get a lot of extra pasture growth where we fed the cows. But there was quite a lot more than we thought, especially compared to the spread manure. And spread manure is generally good, to spread on a pasture. But it was surprising, it did show some difference, but where the cows were fed was way, way better. And when we measured, because we measured the nutrients in the soil, and we measured it in a pattern so we could tell how it was spread throughout the field, there was huge differences, especially in the nitrogen and potassium, based on where the cows spread their time. So we could basically map out the field and show these visual maps of the nutrient concentration. And it was really eye-opening how much nutrient was there, like how much was captured by the pasture. And where we spread the manure, there was virtually nothing we could measure in the soil.
Sure. And was that nutrient mapping in that slideshow that you sent to me?
It is, yeah.
Okay. That slideshow and the paper that Paul wrote will both be linked at workingcows.net/5. So you can go to the show notes page at workingcows.net/5, and you can check out these resources that Paul developed after this paper was finished, if you're curious about some of the specifics of what they discovered through this study. I guess the other thing that I wanted to ask in regard to the surprises was, is there something that's missing from the spread manure that the cows are adding to the soil? Is there a nutrient that they're adding to the soil that the spread manure isn't adding to the soil? Is that why it was so much better, the nutrients?
Sort of. Like when we got these results, the big thing was to explain them, and I came from a crop production background, so I didn't exactly know, but it seemed like nobody else did at the time either. So I went back and I worked out the nutrient content of the hay we brought on that field. You can take your protein content and work that into nitrogen. You can measure your phosphorus and potassium and whatever. And it turned out there was a lot of nutrient in those bales. And what I didn't realize is that cows don't use that much of it. They use roughly, I think it's 10% or so of the nitrogen and 20% of the phosphorus. The rest goes straight through the cow. So there was a lot of nutrient there, and it by studying the literature, there's been at least at that time there was very little research on this kind of thing, like feeding cows out on pasture. There was a lot of research on feeding cows in corrals and feedlots. A lot of it from the States, actually. And what they were saying in the States is that a lot of that nutrient that goes through the cow, it comes out in the urine form as talking about the nitrogen. It comes out in the urine mostly as a urea form. Urea is like the fertilizer you buy. It's very it can be lost very easily, And basically what you're doing in a corral is you're spreading lots of effectively liquid nitrogen fertilizer in a place where it has nowhere to go. And there's also, unfortunately, an enzyme in the manure that comes out the back end that accelerates that loss. So it seems like what happens in a feedlot is it's sort of an evaporating pan for nitrogen, and it just goes up into the air as ammonia, and it gets carried away to wherever it goes. Whereas when they fed in the pasture, I guess you weren't getting the concentration maybe or something, and you captured a lot more of it. But with the potassium, that's also mostly a urine nutrient, and it kind of got captured in the ground. But we're also getting quite a bit more potassium than was even in the bales, and it was a hard thing to track down. But I found that at least in our soils, there's a fair bit of potassium locked in the soil, and what the urine does, I believe it's the ammonia ions or something. It's in that presentation. They unlock the potassium from the soil. So you're kind of recovering. There's a fair bit in the hay. There's also a fair bit it actually unlocked. Whereas phosphorus didn't seem to make much difference. Like phosphorus is not very mobile. So that is, you get good recovery from a corral and about the same where you fed the cattle.
Sure. What were the dates of this study? When was this study conducted as far as the time of the year is concerned?
We put the cows out about the middle of November, and we took them out around the end of March. And the idea was at that particular location, that's about the middle of Saskatchewan, that's, get them in when the ground is frozen up and pull them out before the ground thaws in the spring.
Sure. Yeah, and that kind of helps with the issues that might be related to having cows on there when it's thawed out. So you don't have to worry about putting in a lane for them to get to their water source or anything like that.
Yeah, or I'd have the question, guys say, well, one of the guys I knew in school, he had cattle, and he says, yeah, we feed the cattle out on pasture in this one spot all the time, and it's terrible. And I says, well, you ever take them off? And he goes, no. They're in there when it's wet. They pound the ground out. They graze it short. Extra nutrient is just one thing of making a pasture grow better. If you compact the soil too much, and in some areas that's going to be a problem when you winter feed, then it's going to cause you issues that way.
Sure. Yeah, and you're going to have to figure out, I think and we'll get into this, part of the benefits that you guys found is that you were feeding these cows evenly over the whole field. You weren't feeding in the same place twice. And so they were moving across that field evenly, and that helped, I imagine. Yeah,
as much as we could, yeah.
Sure. What was the stocking rate? Do you remember?
Stocking rate, we had 64 cows on 10 acres for 130 days. So I believe it was around 830 or so.
Right. So that was 32 cows in each 5-acre pasture, right?
That's right, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then you had some more in a feedlot that you were kind of comparing to the two herds that were fed with Bale grazing and with the hay processor.
Yeah. Because part of the idea of the trial was to compare how the cattle did, how the cows did performance-wise, and what kind of wastage they were doing, and looking at the overall economics of the process.
Sure. So how were you controlling their access to the hay bales?
They were given, we moved them every, I believe, 3 to 4 days. You'd open it was basically where the bale grazing was, all the bales were put in the field kind of evenly placed in the fall, and then electric wire limited their access. So you kind of fed them from the one end of this big field and just moved the wire every 3-4 days. Where we fed with the Bale processor, of course, he just went in with the tractor and the processor and set the same kind of a feeding schedule and went back and forth in the field.
We are talking here today on the Working Cows podcast with Paul Jungnitsch of Alberta Ag and Forestry. We are going to take a quick break, thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back to continue this discussion. We're going to talk a little bit more about this paper. Specifically, we're going to focus in on forage growth, animal performance, and economics when we get back. This episode has been brought to you in part by ChrisWilliamsAudio.com. If you're a musician, podcaster, or filmmaker, making your product sound great is crucial. Don't settle for audio that's less than professional. No matter what type of audio service you need, Chris Williams and his team have got you covered. Head on over to ChrisWilliamsAudio.com for all your audio production needs. We're back here with Paul Jungnitsch talking about his paper, The Effect of Cattle Winter Feeding Systems on Soil Nutrients, Forage Growth, Animal Performance, and Economics. We have covered the forage growth, or we've covered the soil nutrients piece. I'd like to focus in a little bit here on the forage growth, animal performance, and economics. So let's hit that first piece there, the forage growth. What did you guys notice in regards to forage growth through the Bale grazing strategy specifically?
With where we fed on the field in the spring, like when you pull off the cows in March and the snow melted and everything, the field didn't look very good at all because you had the manure there. You had we fed a mixture of hay and straw, and the straw is kind of a marginal thing, especially for bale grazing and especially on a bunch grass, which we had to use. So the field looked pretty ugly. There was a fair bit of unevenness, and as the season went by, the grass recovered and it started to look pretty good. Where the straw was the heaviest, then the regrowth was limited. It was better where the processor had spread the hay and straw more evenly. But growth-wise, we had a lot more growth overall on where we fed the cows on the field, and we had a lot more protein too. There was a lot more nitrogen there, so it was a much healthier looking pasture at the end of it.
Sure. How did it compare to the test plot?
The check was low on nitrogen, all the before. I think they'd fertilized it the year or two before, but it was fairly low on nitrogen and didn't grow particularly much. Where we spread the raw manure and the compost, it did look somewhat better, better color, somewhat better growth, but it was quite a bit behind what where we fed the cows in both overall yield and in protein.
Sure. Do you think that's related to the urea spread through the urine?
Yeah, for sure. There was a lot more nitrogen there, and so you had the urea that was spread. When we measured it in the soil, that was measured as immediately available nitrogen, just like as if you'd fertilized. So that went directly into the plants, and then of course you had the more slow release nitrogen that would be in the dung, and so that was spread. And then you had the effect, if the residue wasn't too heavy, that also released nutrients as it rotted, plus it would trap moisture. So, a big part of how successful the growth would be is how you manage the residue and how even you get it, and the type of grass you pick, right? We picked the bunch grass, which is not optimal, especially if you're feeding straw.
What about animal performance? That's the next piece of your paper. Animal performance, how was that measured?
We measured them for condition and weight. What we found is that over the winter, there wasn't really much difference. The bale grazing did slightly better than the others, but they ate a little bit more feed too. So we basically called it a draw. Like, I think the bale grazing, they both weighed a little more and their condition was a little better, but they ate a little more feed too. A key thing though is that we did have wind shelters up. So we had portable wind fence, and we moved them around the pasture as the winter went. But you could tell when it's 30 below and the wind's blowing, they really like those shelters. Otherwise, they would just wander around the pasture.
Sure. I think maybe part of that could be attributed to the fact that those cows weren't running after a tractor. We had Melinda Sims on the previous episode or a couple episodes ago, and we talked about windrow grazing, and she said that they've found that they maintain condition because they're not chasing a tractor every time it comes into the field. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, it was a little bit when we started the trial. Like I said, up where I was from, which is quite a bit farther north in a different province, the cattlemen were getting quite comfortable with this kind of winter feeding. I mean, they would winter feed many, many different ways, but just feeding the cows out in the pasture was getting to be quite accepted. Where I was doing the trial, a lot of the ranchers felt that, this would be terrible on the cattle. You need to have them inside and protected, but, it's, I guess when you think about it, it's not like the temperature was any different where they're in a corral or if they're in a pasture. And all they need is wind protection, which they had in the yard or the pasture, so everything was good.
I think that something that we have kind of danced around here is the economics piece of this, and I think there are quite a few different ways that we can analyze the economics of bale grazing. First of all, is how did it compare economically to the feedlot?
The feed and bedding. It was a little hard to compare in a way because we fed a slightly different ration. Like in the feedlot, we fed a tub ground. It was a green feed type mix. So it was a little harder to compare exactly apples to oranges. But based on what we had, there was quite a lot of there was fuel savings. There was didn't have to haul the manure. There was much greater pasture growth, and I think we looked at feed waste, and the waste was actually not as much different as we thought, particularly. Other than it looked like feeding straw on especially with the bale grazing, was a little tough to do efficiently.
Sure.
That the overall economics were quite a bit in favor of the feeding the cows out in the field.
Sure. And they were in favor of feeding the cows out in the field, whether you did it with a bale processor or bale grazing?
That's right, yeah. That's the bigger thing you notice with a bale processor is, you're inside a warm tractor when you're feeding. When they're feeding with the bale grazing, then you had to walk around, you had to cut strings, you had to get out there in your skidoo suit, right? But on the other hand, we looked at fuel use and we looked at machine starts, and your need for machinery in the bale grazing system was almost basically nothing once you had the bales out there. Whereas with the other stuff, you were running a machine every few days. And in the yard, which was quite an intensive system with a tub grinder and then regular feeding every day, we were using a lot of machinery and a lot of fuel. So that was it really depends how you price out that kind of thing, what your machinery costs and what your fuel costs. But there was big differences in how you kind of look, in the different systems, how they compared.
I think that the interesting thing to me is that you can probably get by with quite a bit smaller piece of machinery when it comes to the bale grazing, especially if you're not putting up the hay yourself. I think what we're thinking about doing on our own ranch and our own winter feeding system is we're going to set those bales mostly with a skid steer and probably cut the strings off when we set them. Is there any disadvantages to doing it that way as far as cutting the strings off early?
Grant would be the best guy to talk to about that. There's different ways you can set them. You can set them on end, or you can set them the other way. Sometimes you can have issues with wind pushing them around a bit. I think most often you don't. But Grant would be the best guy to talk to about that, how it's working in the long run. He's tried it in all different kinds of ways and different kinds of bales and stuff.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I forgot to touch on was long-term forage growth improvement. Was there any findings as far as long-term forage growth improvement?
Oh yeah, I only measured for a year and a half basically. That's kind of the length of time I had, and the forage growth was just getting better and better. I went back to the pasture, I think it was 4 or 5 years later, and it was still noticeably better where we fed the bales. So the forage improvement seems to last a long time. And the one thing, of course, is that when you feed like that, you're only going to cover so much land. So what a lot of guys do is they'll pick areas that are need the most kind of boosting in the pasture. So you pick your poorer humps or whatever. But a big thing is keep that yard, that feeding site moving, right? If you're just feeding in the same spot year after year after year, you're kind of wasting that nutrient. So it's you're basically spreading fertilizer. So if you think of it that way, it makes a lot more sense how you set stuff out.
Sure. Not only are you wasting that fertilizer that you're spreading, you're also doing damage to the soil with compaction issues and overgrazing issues when you feed on the same spot year after year. Is that accurate?
Well, if you're feeding them in an area where you got frozen ground like that, and you're taking them off before it unthaws, probably not. But one thing they worry about here a little bit is that all that nutrient, you could have runoff into water or whatever, right? So environmentally wise too, you want to watch your site. So, if there's runoff, it's not running into a creek or coulee. And again, the more you spread that nutrient out, the more the grass is going to be able to use that, and the more benefit you're going to get. So it's a win-win environmentally and in pasture production.
I think that kind of covers the paper as far as just kind of hitting the high points of it. And I would encourage people to check out workingcows.net/5 for the paper and the presentation with the slides. One thing is I was looking through the slide presentation, I was wondering if Alan Savory has had any influence in some of what you guys are doing as far as kind of carbon sequestration and those ideas.
That was kind of beyond, you say this kind of thing, it has a lot of different aspects to it, right? And I've seen the thing where, you're boosting pasture production, so you're boosting, root growth and carbon sequestration, and you're saving all that you're basically conserving nitrogen that you don't have to buy, right? So that's a gain too for the environment. I seen a study, I think it was in New York, where they were looking at lots of better earthworm, like the earthworms like that too, under where the bales were. There's all sorts of things you can look at. It's interesting though, because Savory, I believe, did a lot of his work in Africa originally.
Correct? Yes, sir.
And when I was looking for some sort of, when you do this kind of thing, you do a research review first, right? To see if anybody had done anything similar. Couldn't find anything. I finally found something when I was done. It was in Africa. And what they'd done there is historically, it's on like a grazing area. They would graze their livestock, and then they would pen them in an area for some time. And then they would plant their corn where they'd pen their livestock, and they would keep this kind of thing around. They would basically, use that method. And when modern times came, they said, well, no, you got to put your cows or put your whatever, goats or sheep or whatever, in a barn, and then haul them near by hand and spread that, and then plant your corn there. And they weren't getting near the corn crops, and they wondered why. And they tested it, and it was exact same kind of thing, right? Testing the growth where you spread manure from manually versus where you spread it just with the animals. And they had the exact same results, like big gains in nutrient from when you let the cows or the livestock spread it themselves, and big losses or much less yield where you use the barn, right? And anybody who works in a barn, that ammonia, that smell of money that's burning your eyes, that's the smell of money you're actually losing, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, I thank you again. I appreciate so much you being willing to sit down with me a second time. And is there anything else that we haven't covered or that you'd like to mention?
A big takeaway I always tell guys is don't get hung up on bale grazing or swath grazing or any particular method. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. The big thing is feeding cattle out on a pasture versus feeding them in a corral. Sometimes, for sure you might have to bring them in a corral, but be aware that whatever method you use to feed them out in the field, that's going to get you your nutrient out there. And you start looking into those patterns and things, you can realize why, say, you don't want your cows to go into the trees if you want to keep that nutrient where the grass is growing. You don't want them to concentrate in particular areas. There's a whole lot of things that go with that when you realize they're basically mobile fertilizer factories, right?
Yep. Yeah, well, I thank you. Appreciate your time. Very helpful. I think, some really strong paradigm shift things here as far as the strategy of feeding evenly over the field to get an even spread of the fertilizer, realizing that the urine is actually essentially urea fertilizer and that they will spread it for you. You don't have to pay for diesel fuel and fertilizer to go out and spread that yourself. So just some really helpful stuff, and I appreciate you coming on and helping us out here today with a little bit of a paradigm shift. So thank you.
Welcome.
This episode has been brought to you in part by Kamak Ranch Supply. Check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. They understand the needs of ranchers and farmers, whether you need to take care of your livestock, horses, or even building supplies. They have everything you need to work your cows, whether that be the chute you work them through, the water you bring them to, or the tools you use to make them go up that chute a little bit faster. So check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. Some very useful information there with Paul Jungnitsch of Alberta Ag and Forestry. Links to all of the resources that we discussed on this episode of the Working Cows podcast will be available at workingcows.net/5. Check out workingcows.net/5 for links to Paul's paper, as well as a TED Talk by Alan Savory and the presentation that Paul mentioned with some of the field spread of the nutrients and some pictures there. Also, tune in next week to the Working Cows podcast. We will have Aaron Berger of University of Nebraska Extension on talking about cow depreciation. This is an out-of-the-box topic that I think has a lot of potential to really increase the profitability of your operation. So please tune in next week for episode 6 of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.